And facing his first election as Labor leader, Kevin Rudd is with me in our Sydney studio. Kevin Rudd, after today, you've now got another set of tax scales to remember. Are we going to see another bout of Me Too on tax policy after the Howard Costello tax announcement today?
Well, Kerry, I am an economic conservative. The Prime Minister doesn't seem to like it when I say that, but I am. That means taking a cautious approach to public finance. The government's official financial outlook was released only a few hours ago. We're studying that. And against our criteria for tax reform, which is incentive, which is participation, competitiveness, simplicity and fairness for working families, we'll be assessing what the government said, but we'll be putting out our own approach to tax in due season. OK, on the basis of what you've seen today of the Prime Minister's basic plan, do you accept that it's an attractive plan? Do you accept that it does provide incentives to work by getting those rates down, by raising the threshold for the lower income earners? Kerry, when I referred before to the government's official fiscal outlook, that's a 270-page document, and in it is contained quite radical changes to the size of the projected government surplus. Therefore, against all the work that we've been doing on tax modelling in recent months, we've now got to sit down, look at what the surplus numbers contain and calibrate the work and the research we've done against that. I believe in taking a cautious and considered approach to this. It's very important policy, but we'll put ours out in due season when we're ready. But do you have a tax policy ready right now after 10 months of your leadership? Will Wayne Swan have to go back to the drawing board, and to what extent? Kerry, we have spent many, many months modelling a whole range of possibilities under the umbrella of tax reform. What we now have is a new set of numbers in terms of the budget outlook because of the production today, this afternoon, of the mid-year fiscal and economic outlook. And do you accept that for every day you don't have a tax policy, the government is going to be saying, you don't have a tax policy, we have? Mr Howard will engage in negative campaigning whenever he has the opportunity to do so. The key thing here is the government has been in. Mr Costello today admitted that for months they've been working on this with the full support of the Treasury, and out they plonk the official fiscal outlook today and a tax policy within 30 seconds of doing so. A cautious and considered approach means that we should do this in our own season, and we will do that. And however Mr Howard and Mr Costello want to run around and characterise the politics of that, and the sky will fall in if we don't produce a tax policy by Wednesday lunchtime, that's a matter for them. We will do it correctly, in a sober fashion, and a conservative fashion, because public finance is fundamentally important. What headline policies do you plan to release during this campaign? What headline policy areas are still there for you to bring new policy to bear? Are you factoring in the prospect of the government releasing a raft of policies to try and keep you on the back foot? Well, Kerry, they may do that because Mr Howard's a very clever politician and he'll try and drum some things up. Oh. But hang on. We have all year spent time outlining a plan for the country's future. Mr Howard glibly refers just before to an education revolution. We've released 5 or 6 chapters of that revolution with fully costed funding attached to each of those policies, from early childhood through to technical training in schools and the rest. For our reform plan for hospitals, a $2 billion plan there, and a timetable for its implementation, $4.7 billion for high-speed broadband. We've actually sketched the architecture of our plan for the future with detailed policy elements within it. We have a plan for the future. We've got fresh ideas for the future. But you're going to have to keep the impetus going, aren't you? Sure. Do you have it in your kit bag? Look, have you got more on health? Have you got more on education? They're 2 big-ticket items. Well, if you put that question to Mr Howard about what he's about to release during the campaign, I'm sure he would apply some caution to his answer. But as I said yesterday, what the country's looking for is new leadership for the country's future, fresh ideas for the country's future challenges. And in those critical areas, let me tell you, we'll have more to say, including on climate change and water. You can't just dream these things up at 5 minutes to midnight, which is what Mr Howard seems to be doing, and plonking things on the table, expecting people to believe that he suddenly stands for acting on climate change and water, that he suddenly stands for reversing the tide on education, where disinvestment in our universities has stood out across the developed economies. Well, some people may fall for that, but you know something? After all these years in office, I think people are starting to see through Mr Howard's tactics. Mr Howard said today, quote, "If Mr Rudd becomes Prime Minister, unemployment
will go up. He's referring to your promise of return to unfair dismissal laws and more generally to your plans to carve up work choices. How will you keep a lid on wages if you win government? Will you guarantee a continuing drop in unemployment, as Mr Howard is doing? And if so, how will you do it?
You know, the core challenge or charge which Mr Howard makes, that if you get rid of work choices, it bumps up unemployment. That's his core argument. Well, the problem is he and Mr Costello don't agree. Mr Costello said quite recently that the industrial relations system itself, referring to work choices, doesn't of itself increase or have an impact on the employment level. That's what he was saying. Now, you can't just advance that argument, Mr Howard as Prime Minister, and undermine previous positions which have been put by the Treasurer. What you said before in your discussion with Mr Howard is dead right. We're in the midst of a global economic boom. We're running at record levels of economic growth across the OECD for the best in 30 years. We're running record levels of low unemployment, the best in 20 or 30 years. We're in the Asia-Pacific region, selling commodities to China and India in the midst of their boom, the best commodity prices in 50 years, and Mr Costello and Mr Howard say, it's all our good work. Well, come on, give us a break. That's just not true.
The government is clearly going to batter you on the image of a party dominated by the trade unions. How do you answer criticism about Labor's narrow base in Parliament with so much trade union influence? Even some of Labor's icons like Barry Jones, John Button and others have been very critical of the lack of diversity represented amongst Labor MPs in the federal parliament.
If you look at the team, we have people in Labor's front bench who have worked as barristers, solicitors, teachers, economists, mayors of municipalities. We have former rock stars, underemployed diplomats who speak Chinese. There's a whole bunch of people there. And at
the same time, Mr Howard would say 70% of them have been trade union members.
Well, do you know something? That assumes that folk who have worked, and I don't even know that number is even vaguely correct, but that assumes that someone who's worked representing working people hasn't done other things with their lives as well. Ask the people who have suffered from asbestosis whether they appreciate having their representatives through the trade union movement stand up for them in key cases against large companies. In this upcoming election, I have 3 former military officers from the Australian Defence Force running as Labor candidates. Can I say that, together with 4 municipal mayors or deputy mayors, 3 local councillors, 2 or 3 business operators, Mr Howard has a key line and theme here, delivered to him by Crosby Textor, which is to say, unions, 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 skyfall in, skyfall in, skyfall in. Well, that's terrific. But guess what? It doesn't actually equate with the reality.
You talk about new leadership, but yours is also relatively unknown leadership so far, particularly leadership under pressure. But if you've developed something of a reputation, but you have, dare I say it, developed something of a reputation for blaming others when things go wrong, of having a glass jaw, not a good look when the buck is supposed to stop at the Prime Minister's desk.
Well, you know, I find that a remarkable charge from Mr Howard, and he's been saying it every day for a long, long time now. This is the Prime Minister who's never accepted a skerrick of responsibility for children overboard, a Prime Minister who's never accepted a skerrick of responsibility for taking us to war in Iraq, and when he was told that by doing so he would increase the terrorist threat, not reduce it, and a Prime Minister who's not taken a skerrick of responsibility for $300 million worth of bribes being paid to Saddam Hussein to buy guns, bombs and bullets for later use against Australian troops. I mean, that's just a wonderful debating point for Mr Howard, but against those huge measures, taking a country to war, bribing a foreign dictator, and children overboard, which so much impacted this country's international reputation. When did Mr Howard take responsibility for that? Comes to fixing the hospital system, I want to have a system where the buck stops with me. Mr Howard wants to preserve the blame game.
Kevin Rudd, we're out of time. But again, I look forward to our next interview too. Thank you.
Thanks, Kerry.